All right, welcome to a our first online lecture. So today we're going to be going over the cameras and when to use them, what to use, how to use them, and whatnot. So right now we have pretty much just been rendering from our perspective menu and our perspective screen, and we just kind of get our basic renders however we want, which is good when we're just trying to figure out how things are going to look and whatnot. But when we kind of get to the point where we actually want to make sure that we are being consistent even with a still render, then using cameras is very useful. Because what will happen is that you can still use your perspective view to work on either animation or modeling or what have you. And then you can have the camera just kind of be set where you want it to be. And you can always go back, and it makes things a lot easier. Sometimes, even if you're modeling, if you want to understand how things might look if you do one thing or another, because that will allow you to have a consistent look and feel of it instead of it. If you kind of like change the angle a little bit, things can look better or worse. This way, it will also help you to make sure that you are having a consistent comparison on like your modeling or texturing and stuff like that. All right, so first of all, you'll notice that you'll have your camera object right here, and then if you hold it down, you have a couple different ones. We're going to have your camera, you're going to have a target camera, a stereo camera, a motion camera, and a camera crane. So we're going to really be going over the camera and the target camera and the camera crane. The stereo camera is actually going to be used for if you're going to be rendering in 3D, but this will work and will actually work very similar to the regular camera. So first of all, we're going to go ahead and create our first camera. You can either click the button right there, or we can hold it down and then select the camera. Now, once you do this, one thing that you're going to notice here is that you now have like these little orange dots. You have these little orange dots left, right, around the area. And the reason why is because currently, once you create a camera, it is going to be set to whatever the perspective view is as the default um, location. Because the way that they think about it is that like you kind of figure out where you want it to look when you're in your perspective view, and then once you create it, it's going to kind of make it sure that it's going to be started right there. So if I move inside my perspective view, you'll see that you now have this. And this is what your camera is going to look like. Now, none of this gets rendered. These are all kind of like splines without any type of NURB objects and stuff like that. So they're just objects in your workspace, but they don't have anything to do with your camera. So by default, this will allow you to see which the direction is. The way that these cameras rotate with the default one is that they are going to rotate. So they're not actually going to rotate like back here. They're going to rotate from this point. And if I analyze this, how the software looks at this is that this is like the point where it hits the lens, and that's like the closest that it's going to render. So anything that kind of goes past this point is not going to be rendered. The computer doesn't see it as far as a render goes for the camera itself. All right. So again, so then where things rotate, it's going to be rotating from that point right there. So instead of it rotating from right here, it's going to rotate right there. So if you want to have the look and feel of having something rotate a little bit farther back, we're actually going to be able to get away with doing some of that with the camera crane. But for the basic movements and stuff like that, you can work perfectly fine within the camera. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to select the camera, and we're going to look at some of the different options. As you can see, There are all sorts of different types of settings that we can play around with. Different sorts of inside each of these tabs, there's more settings in itself. So it's very can get very complicated, and they do try to mimic the real world aspects of a camera. And there's a couple different reasons for that. A is that there's why reinvent the wheel when you can just kind of use the same ideas of how a camera would work in the real world. And B is that if you get all these stats and stuff like that, and you can match your render to have the same settings as far as your real world camera that you were trying to add or like combine your CGI into real world footage. And I believe that there are cameras out there that allow you to export data as far as cameras the camera move or maybe the camera like maybe like the focal length and stuff like that. If any of these things change within the recording, I believe that there are ways that that there are some cameras that do export data with that, but they are probably a lot more expensive because that that they're going to be used for people who are going to be using CGI, so they are going to be a lot more expensive. Okay, so right off the bat, we have our basic. Nothing is really different with inside here. If you want to change a different color of how this is going to display, so like if you're in a really light scene and you can't really determine where your camera is, you could always turn it on, and then you can pick whatever color you want it to be. Hit OK, and then as you can see, this updates. So that's very useful, especially if we want to make sure that we can see where our camera is, so that it doesn't blend in. So even if we don't have it selected, we can understand where our camera is. Okay, coordinates. So these all work very similar to anything else that we've done as far as modeling and or moving our objects inside there. You have your position, your scaling, and your rotations and stuff like that. All right, next one over is object. So by default, they are set to projection type is perspective. Now, this is going to be the majority projection type that you're going to use for cameras, unless for some reason you want to change them. We do have all these different options, and they give you different looks as well. You have your left, right, front, and back, top, bottom. Those are all going to give you your ability to render out of, like if something was one of your orthographic views where you really don't have any depth and everything is rendered in the same depth. It's just layering is different. But if we want to have a different one as well, so like a frog, bird, isometric and stuff like that, those will give you a different look and feel to it. By default, we have the classic 36 millimeter. You can change what type of focal length you want to have. You can make it custom if you want. You just change those numbers right there. And then you can have like wide angle, super wide. These will give you the looks as you would if you actually use these types of focal lengths with a real video camera. All right, sensor size, film gate. This again allows you to change your film gate if you're really into the focal length and all this stuff and understand how that works. That can be very useful. Again, so what you can see here is that you do have the option to keyframe these. So if you wanted to change these through filming, you can do that. So there's nothing wrong with that. All these little dots mean that you can actually have that. So, alright. So next thing we have is we have our field of view, horizontal and vertical. We aren't going to really get into this right now. But the field of view kind of lets you know on where that, how big or wide that is. Now these, as you can see, as I'm changing the field of view, it's actually going to be changing my focal length and stuff like that. So it does change those numbers. So these are all kind of linked together. All right. And then you have your film offset and stuff like that. All the things that you can play around with is that if you want to play with the white balance, you can as well. This, as far as if we're just going to be rendering like 3D or not 3D, but just like a normal render, we have our scene inside here, then that's fine. The only time that I probably would play with a white balance is if I want a certain effect to look like that, and or if I'm trying to add my CGI objects or renders into real world renders, that this might help you too as well. So if they have a white balance value, you just throw that in there and you use that with like your HDRI image, and that'll help you get it look more and more like it was actually filmed at the same time, which is actually very important. All right. Next thing we can have is we have our physical. Now this really doesn't work unless on our renderer we change the render to physical. So we can change all these settings inside here, but they don't really do anything unless we actually have the physical renderer selected. It's one of the few things that you actually get with the physical render, especially like your depth of field and stuff like that. Alright, but inside here, you can play with our exposure times, or we have our f-stops, your shutter speeds and stuff like that. Again, if we have all these settings on how the camera is already set up, we can just plug those in, and that works perfectly fine. As far as basic 3D stuff goes, you don't necessarily really have to know a whole lot of this stuff. You really don't have to mess with it if you don't want to. But it is there if you do want to. Alright, so for details, we have our enabled near clipping. So that's going to be anything that is too close right there. It's going to clip it. So that means it will not show up. Now it is, if we can look at this, we'll see that the near clipping value by default is 0 centimeters. So what's going to happen is that it'll only cut things off if they are 0 centimeters. So it means this shows like everything. If we add more value to this, then things that are now 8 centimeters away from the lens, and as you can see, so yeah, 8 centimeters are away from the lens. So anything that's like width between the 8 centimeter mark or 6 centimeter mark, as I have right now, and the lens of the camera, which is that center point, will not be rendered. So if like you have an object that's in the middle, it will actually cut through there and it'll look really weird. But that is something that you can play around with. But as by default, I really don't play with the near clipping. If you want to have far clipping, that's very useful, especially if you have like a really huge scene. Let's say if we built or generated a city with a lot of buildings and stuff like that, and it's a really, really huge city, and maybe we want to be able to see everything if we're really high up, but then when we kind of get down far below, maybe on the street level, then we don't need to see every single thing. So this allows you to kind of cut that down a whole lot, and that's very useful when it comes down to rendering time, because what will happen is that instead of caring about everything when I have my enabled far clipping, that means it's gonna put everything into um, into consideration. So it's going to bounce light and stuff off everything, even if it's not going to be rendered. But if I put a far clipping plane, that means it's only going to worry about anything what's within that far clipping area. So that can technically cut down on render time. Anything that we do for these classes, I don't think is going to really matter. I don't think I've seen anybody's projects so far that has actually had to, or like use that to make it look better, but that is an option as well. All right. The one thing that's really nice though is these options right here. Is your depth of field front blur and your depth of field rear blur. So if you can see, once I turn these on, so I'll turn them both off again. When I turn on my depth of field front blur, that you're gonna now have this line that's right there, and that's gonna be, it's gonna start between the 0, which is the center point of the camera, and the end point, which is this right here. So this representation right here means that any objects that are within this range right here will get that blur effect. Now this is very similar to like a camera when you're changing the focus. So anything that's between where you're really focusing on stuff and the camera lens is going to be blurry. Same thing right here. And then right now, if I turn on the depth of field rear blur, that means anything that's behind this area. So pretty much from this point onwards, this is going to be blurry. So this center area is where your objects are going to look crisp and in focus, and anything outside of that is going to be blurry. Same thing, anything inside here. Now this doesn't really help a ton when you're trying to make something look super realistic. The one thing that kind of really popular that uses this really well are the Lucas the Spider videos. They're like the little CG kind of cartoony little spider dude, and they use a really good depth of field with that, where things will kind of be blurry and whatnot. But if we're just trying to make something that looks really nice with a render, you don't necessarily have to use that as well, but those options are there. One thing that you'll notice is that if you do want to use your depth of field, you are going to have to use the physical renderer, and then you have to go into the physical setting inside the render settings and turn on the depth of field. Because otherwise, even if you have these set up, they're not going to do anything until you actually have that turned on. All right. So the stereoscopic is also like a 3D camera settings. And this, if we can look at this right here, see if it'll pop up or change. Right now the mode is mono, so it means you're only going to have one camera. And if you have a symmetrical, so you have two, you're going to have, let me see if I can turn off these. Okay, so it will give you the look of having these multiple settings with the stereotropical. Also, one of the things you're gonna see here is that your camera now does change from where it just looks like a camera, where it has a 3D thing inside there. But we will now have all these extra lines that kind of gives you the knowing of that you do have 3D. Now you can also change it so you have a left and right. So if you want to make sure that this one is for left and that one's for right, you can manually have two different ones set up. But by default, the symmetrical ones, if you're going to do it, just do it that way. And really what happens, and you can see a little bit better when we actually just create a 3D camera. So if I just create a 3D camera right here. So here's my 3D camera. What you see here, if we make one by default, is that you can now see that there are almost looks like there's two cameras and there's two center points right here. And so what's happening right here is that the right eye is going to be rendered right here, and the left eye is going to be rendered right there. And so that way you get the look of 3D. Because what's happening right here is that you're offsetting it just enough so that you are simulating eyeballs, and that's how you really get depth of field, like a better sense of depth, just because you have 2 points of preference. While you technically don't need both eyes to have a sense of depth, which is a lie, or if people say, well, if you lose an eye, then you have problems with depth perception, or where you have no depth perception. Is not you do have depth perception, is not as great as considered like something else, like if you have both eyes. But again, so that's one way that this simulates it right there. Now, if you want to have 3D cameras, I would suggest that you start off with a 3D, because I believe if you change it to the symmetrical, so the stereotypical, it might actually not be separated enough, so you could still not be setting it up correctly. All right, so there we go. We're gonna go back to our basic camera. All right. So here we have different composition settings, and we'll be able to play around with those when we are actually looking through the camera. And to get to the point where we can actually look through the camera, what we're going to do here is, there's a couple different ways you can go about doing it. One way is to go up to where it says cameras up here, and then use camera, and then you can select the camera. So as you can see, this is I'm going to rename this to main camera, so that main camera has a different name. So if I go up to cameras and use camera, there's that main camera. And now I'm going to be looking inside there. All right. One thing you're going to notice is that, yes, it will still say perspective on here, but we are actually inside the camera view, because you can see you have these little dots where showing where my heights are and my left and rights are, and where the center of it is. Now I can move around here just like a perspective. And one thing that's very important to also understand too is when you are in this mode, you can now see that to the right of your camera, you have like the little target box that is now highlighted. So if I click that off, it'll switch to my perspective view, my orthographic perspective view. And then if I click it again, it's going to go back to that view. So again, you can change your, like, selecting that camera and looking inside of it from the cameras to main cameras and stuff like that. Or you can click this right here. Sometimes what I like to do is that I like to have a different view. So if I want to just have like a two screen view, sometimes I just bring those down, and then I can have, say this is my perspective, this one's my camera's already selected, and then I can have this one be my perspective. And so then what I can do is I can do my work inside here, and then I can also see how where things are located, how it's going to look inside the camera view itself, which is very useful as well to have like this kind of a split screen. This works more. This works a lot better when we are actually getting to animation, because you will definitely want to animate to the camera itself. Um, than other than just kind of like, I mean, you can just animate something that looks really nice, but you definitely want to know where your camera is, because just because something looks nice, it might not necessarily look nice at where the camera is located. So again, this is the whole process of animating to the camera, that thought process. Okay. So again, I am in my view with my camera. Okay, one thing that we're going to see here, now I'm going to go back to the composition, is that these are little composition helpers. So we have our grid. So it kind of gives us a grid to understand on where things would be, as far as, like if I wanted the upper thirds or anything like that I can understand where that is. We have our triangles if you want to have your triangles along with your grids. Again, you can see that you can have these all turned on at the same time, or you can have these all, however you want. We have our golden selection. So it's going to give you a better idea on where things are going to be laid out as far as composition goes. You'll have your golden spiral, which has to do more with like art theory and stuff like that. Not as much as far as film goes, though. And then you can have this one, which can be useful, is like a crosshair. So like if you want to make sure that you always know where your camera is going to be located, because as you can see, that if I have something else selected, that I no longer get my little orange dots, that having at least the crosshairs are really helpful, because they give me like my up and down right there where that's located. It gives me my left and right and up and down as well. All right. And then there's, of course, when you go inside here, you can always change different things inside here. That's what all these little extra little dots are. So like my crosshairs, if I want to have, change my color to my crosshairs to, let's say, like a really crazy deep red, then I can change it to a red. You can change the scaling of it as well. These do not render. So any of these guidelines, they do not render, and they are not going to be something you have to really worry about. All right, so we're not going to worry about the spherical one for right now. Okay, so that is the main camera, or the just normal camera that we have. Okay, so the next one that we have is going to be the target camera. So this is going to work very similar to our target light that we went over in class. It's the same concept, except, the only difference is that it's a camera instead of a light. So this is very useful if you want to do something where your camera is going to rotate around. We can do that as well. So if I want to throw these all into a null, sometimes I do this as well. So if I want to have it like rotate around a certain area, throw these all into a null, make sure that the camera target is where the null is located, and then when I kind of rotate around, I can make sure that it's already there. Now, this can work the same way. You don't necessarily have to use a target camera to kind of get this rotation look, but I do find that sometimes it's very easy to do it along with this, because this helps me line up where I actually want to point it at right there. But it's not necessarily need to be used. Again, this is very useful for doing different things. So like if we are having, we can attach this to, let's say, we'll attach this to the cube. We'll make it a child of the cube. And then what happens is that if I move my cube around, it's going to follow it around. So this is very useful for If we're doing maybe like a scene where we're going to be focusing on the character. Examples would be, if a character is running through the woods and we want to have our camera kind of go parallel and just really focus on the character that's running on there, even if they jump and stuff like that. Or if we want to make sure that we're following them for different reasons, you can make the target a child of a different object, and then you really don't only have to worry about wherever your target camera is as far as the verticals, and you don't really have to worry about your rotation other than your pitch. All right. Inside these cameras, you can see that everything is exactly the same as the previous one. The only one difference you have your target. Now, just like we said when we went over the target inside of the light, it works the exact same. So if we want to change the target object from that thing to a different object, so if I want it to just be the cube itself, we don't necessarily have to use this null object that they give us. We can attach it to a certain object. The only thing that gets really sticky with that is when we are trying to. Well, I mean, yeah, you could change the target object with the keyframes as well. Just I believe that it is not a gradient one, so it's not going to go from like transition from one person to the other person. It's going to be really harsh, and it's going to be like a on or off option. All right, cool. So that's that one. The last one that we're going to go over is, again, we went over the stereo one as well. There's anything really crazy with that. Is we have the camera crane. Now this one isn't something that's necessarily needed, and you can get a lot of these same looks and feels with animating the crane, or with animating your camera. But it is pretty nice to be able to have these options, and a lot of these are really useful, especially if you have a camera crane that you're using in real film, and you get all of these different recordings, and you can input all these into your, like if they get an export of all the different movements that are going with camera crane, you can mimic those exactly, and you can be pretty well set. But the first one that we have, if we're going to go here, is we have our base, and the heading allows you to change the rotation from right here, and the height allows you to make it taller or smaller as well. This doesn't matter if it looks weird or anything like that, just because, again, these are not going to be, even if you look at this, it's not going to be rendered. You're not going to see any like physical geometry. All right, so the next one that we have is going to be our arm, and it's going to be this piece right here. And if I add my length to it, allows me to go higher or lower. And then the pitch allows me to rotate from this point right here, which is different because this one right here with the base, it goes on the base with this rotation is right here, and then the arm, the pitch is the rotation going in this direction. All right, so the next one we have is our head. So the first one is we have our height, and that allows us to extend how long the head arm is. The heading, it allows you to get a better perspective here. Allows you to rotate from this point right here. And then your width gives you how far you want this arm to be. All right, now the next one we have is our camera. Allows you to change the pitch, That's where it's going to rotate from that point. Right there. We have our banking, which allows us to tilt left to right, and then the offset. Kind of you can change where you want it to kind of rotate from, as far as from where the top lens is. Yep. So right here, where we have our top lens, so like by default, normally whenever we rotate our cameras and stuff like that, it's going to be rotating from this point. But with this camera crane, allows you to do some rotations values where it's going to rotate from right here. And this look is a lot different. I mean it's really is very can be very similar as far as it looks, but it's a lot smoother with the rotations of going up or down or stuff like that, or left or right. So to kind of get the same look, you would do inside of a normal camera, you would have to smooth it. You'd have to smooth it out or slow it down as much as the rotation goes. But there's really nothing that you can't do with the normal camera that you could do with this one. Again, this is going to be used more for like if you actually have certain data on the camera crane that's used, then just plug that stuff in there and then you don't have to recreate it. So you don't have to do any motion tracking or anything like that, which can kind of, cutting out another step is as good as possible. All right. One other thing that we're going to kind of go over in here is some different render settings that we have inside here. So once we create a camera, then what you're going to see here is that if I go in here, so I'll see where there is. Okay, I guess again we have our physical render. It gives our different options for that. We have our motion blur right there. When we do our render, like the batch render, right here, so we have add to render queue. Okay, let's just save. What we have right here is that when we add to the render queue, and I'll kind of go over this when we do a little more with rendering and whatnot, is that our camera is where we can kind of then select it. Now, this can be very useful for different things and whatnot. Let's say if I have multiple renders that I need to do, I can have multiple cameras at different points, and I can add all these into my render queue and then render them all out at one time. I don't have to manually stop and wait. I can just kind of make a list of things that need to render and just let the computer do it. So that's one spot that we will see the multiple cameras that we have inside there as well. The other thing that we have to look for is that if we have a certain camera that we're looking through, so we have this camera right here, if we go to cameras and we can definitely switch between these different cameras however we want. And then we can also make sure that we want to use it as the render view. If you have your camera selected inside here, the way that Cinema 4D really works is that if you want to render out of a certain camera, you have to make sure you select it. Unless you go to your render queue and change it. In other 3D software, you can actually set which camera you want to render out of inside the render settings. For some reason, I don't know why Cinema 4D does it a little bit differently, but that's just the way that they kind of do it. So you have to make sure you select the camera that you want, and then you can kind of render it unless you go to add to render queue. And you have your render queue right here. So you can change it to a different camera if you want. So if I have this camera 1 selected, but I really want to render out of the main camera, then we go, let's select that, and then you just hit render, and it's good to go. All right, well, that's going to be it for the cameras, and hopefully that worked out well for you guys. All right.